Today's daf is daf Chav Hey. The Mishnah on daf Chav Daled Amud Beis tells you that there's certain manifestations and fulfillments of Avelus which are limited to the Avelim, which means the close relatives. It's not 100% clear as to why the Mishnah excludes others who are not relatives from, for example, Kriya, or exposing their shoulders, which they did during the burial, or the special Sudas Havra, that first meal that they served after the Kvura. According to some Rishonim, the Mishnah is addressing the case of Chol Moed. And on Chol Moed, because of the mitzvah of Simchas Yontif, we want to curtail the Avelus to its barest minimum, and therefore only allow Avelus for the sake of the Avelus. And now we begin the Gemara on Daf Chav Hey Amud Aleph. The Gemara asks the following question: Vafilu Chacham, are you telling me that even if a Chacham dies who taught the Rabbin Torah, and he was a key in transmission of the Torah, even in his case, only the close relatives can manifest Avelus? Tanya, we learned in a Brisa, Chacham Shemeis Hakol Krovav. It seems that we're all considered like relatives. Hakol Krovav, we're not relatives. Hakol Krovav, we're like relatives, and therefore we are obligated in the mitzvah of Avelus vis-a-vis the Chacham, because we depend upon his transmission of the Torah. So that the Mishnah seems to have a flat, unqualified statement that applies in every case, that no one other than the relatives are going to be permitted to manifest Avelus in those ways that we enumerated in the Mishnah. But here we see that even those who are not relatives are considered like relatives. And the Brisa says, Hakol Korim Olav, when the Chacham dies, everyone will be Korea. Hakol Cholzanov, everyone will bear their shoulders when they take out the deceased to burial. Hakol Mavrim Olav Berchava. And they would have a special meal, a Sudas Havra, which is a Sudas Avelus, out there in the public for the sake of the Chacham. So now we have to go back to our Mishnah, and we have to limit our Mishnah. The Mishnah is talking about a case other than a Chacham. So don't jump the gun that because the Mishnah failed to mention Chacham, therefore we assume that this law would apply straight across the board, even in the case of the death of a Chacham. That's not true. The Mishnah is addressing a case of someone who's not a Chacham. But Enochinami, had he been a Chacham, then even those who are not blood relatives would still be obligated in Avelus. Now the Gemara asks the second question. Forget about the case of a Chacham. Let's go down one notch. What about Adam Kosher? I'm going to prove to you from a Brisa that even in the case of an Adam Kosher who's not a Chacham, we're obligated in the midst of Kriya. And once we have that Brisa, then we're very confused about our Mishnah, because our Mishnah seems to have a flat statement. Okay, maybe the Mishnah omitted the case of a Chacham, but why would the Mishnah go further and omit the case of a Kosher? The Mishnah seems to assume flat, outright, unqualified, that we don't have Kriya unless we're relative. That's not true, because if an Adam Kosher dies, as we're going to prove in the Brisa, there is a Chiyuv Kriya, even if you're not related to the Adam Kosher. So why did the Mishnah omit that? And the Brisa says, what crime did a person commit such that the punishment for that crime is that he will bury his young children? So that Midah Keneged Midah, he'll have to do a tikkun and rectify his Avera. And if he didn't mourn over the loss of another Kosher, he'll mourn over his own children ever. And the Gemara is not willing to take that Brisa at face value. Yivke V'yis abel. Are you telling me that he's going to bury his own children and he will weep and mourn? El bona kashakel mine. Why should the children suffer for the iniquities of their parents? So we have a principle that children do not suffer, they're not punished for the sins of their parents. So even if you'll tell me that the parent was guilty of not mourning of the loss of an adam kosher and not doing priya and so forth and so on, that's not enough a justification that chas v'shalom his children should die. We have a principle in the pasuk at the end of Dvarim. It says, "Each becheto yumasu." A person dies in his own sin. Ella says the Gemara, "Mipnei shelo bacha b'sabel al adam kosher." What happens here is that he will be punished, but not that his children will die as a punishment for the father's sin, that the father ignored the death of another kosher and omitted kriya, and did not mourn and cry and grieve over the loss of another kosher. That's not a punishment for the children. The children, if they have to be taken away, it's for other sins, whatever the sins might be, or whatever the reasons might be, the death of the children. But if you want to talk about why the father has to suffer this bechi and this avelus over the loss of his children, that's a punishment for the fact that he was not bocha, he was not misabel on an adam kosher. Bocha u misabel adam kosher mochelo al kol avonosov. Had he done what he had to do, what he was obligated to do, and mourn over the loss of an adam kosher, that would have generated a mechila, and he would not have suffered the suffering of losing his young children. Because of the cover that a person gives to another kosher. We see, and we've mentioned this time and time again, that Avelus is essentially covered mess. It is respect for the dead. And here, had he given the due respect for the dead of another kosher, that he would not have suffered this punishment. There would have been an automatic built-in mechila that would have forgiven him for his sins. He would have been spared the punishment of the death of his young children. Now, there's an entire discussion here about who qualifies as a quote-unquote adam kosher. And the bottom line is that an adam kosher is not someone that we think he is. We think an adam kosher is a person who's, is a sheni yid. No, it goes way beyond that. An adam kosher is a person who doesn't sin at all. He's not a great scholar. He did not dedicate himself to the study of Torah, but he's kosher. Kosher means he's zach v'naki. He's pure. He doesn't violate any sins. He is a perfect record. And that's an adam kosher. So the Gemara answers the lav adam kosher, who again, we're going to say that the Mishnah refers to a regular person who died. He's not a chacham. He's not even an adam kosher. Again, even an adam kosher. Again, someone who never sinned. He doesn't fit into those unique categories. And therefore, if you're not a relative, you don't mourn. And certainly, according to those Rishonim, you don't express your mourning and manifest grief on Chol HaMoed. So the Gemara now asks, we have another case in which someone other than a relative is obligated in the mitzvah of kriya, and we're not talking about neither a chacham nor an adam kosher, but rather someone who's kai, he happens to be there at the moment of yitzias neshama. If you're present at the time of someone's death, chiyuve mechayve yachayv in kriya. This Sanya we learned in a brayso of Shimon Elazar Omer Omed al Hames b'shas yitzias neshama chayav likroa. I don't know exactly a religious doctor, who works in a medical ward for dangerously ill patients. I'm not sure how he fulfills this halacha because, very often, not just the physician, the nurse, and the whole team of medical practitioners might be exposed almost on a constant basis to yitzias neshama. But it's interesting that the Brisa gives an explanation for the chi of kriya if someone is standing there at the time of the shir. Yitzias Neshama. L'maseh doma, we need an analogy to another case where you have to cut kriya, and that is l'sefer Torah shenisraf. If you're chas v'shalom witness to the burning of a sefer Torah, which unfortunately was something that happened throughout the persecutions in the long, bitter exile of the Jewish people, chayav l'kroa, he's chayav in kriya. And the Tanakh always compares man to a sefer Torah. Just like we have a chiv kriya, if we are there present and witness the burning of a sefer Torah, so too we're chayav in kriya if we're there at the time of Yitzias Neshama. And the neshama of a person, ner mitzvah v'torah, or the neshama of a person is compared to ner Hashem nishmas adam, to the fulfillment of all the mitzvahs. Every Jew, every Ish Israeli is an embodiment in potential of the fulfillment of all Tariq mitzvahs that are written in the Torah. And when that neshama leaves and it departs, it's as if all Tariq mitzvahs went down to its death, and therefore it's like a Sefer Torah that has all the Tariq mitzvahs that was destroyed. And the Gemara again says, the Lokai Hasan B'Shas Yitzias Neshama. The Mishnah is not referring to a situation, a scenario in which he was present at the time of someone's death. We have 3 cases in which even someone who's not related to the Niftar would be chayav in kriya. Number 1, a chacham, and that's a chiyuv kriya on everyone. Number 2, another kosher, again, a chiyuv kriya on everyone. And number 3, if you're there, b'shas yitzias neshama of a Jew. And now the Gemara tells us the following story. Ki nach nafshi de Rav Safra, when Rav Safra died, lo karu rabbanan aleh. Why didn't the rabbanan cut kriya when we've just established that when a chacham dies, we're all chayav in kriya? Amri, because they said, lo gamrina mine. The status of a chacham vis-a-vis the chiyuv kriya when he dies is a chacham that taught Torah. To you, to me, and to him, we are all indebted to the chacham, as if he was our own Rebbe, because we learned Torah from him. But in the case of Rav Safra, we, the chachamim, did not learn Torah from him. The Gemara is going to argue against this. So again, those chachamim that did not cut kriya at the time of the death of Rav Safra, they were of the opinion that the halach that requires kriya of the death of a chacham only applies if you're a student and you've learned Torah from that chacham. Abai says to them, you made a mistake. If the brayso that we learned earlier that formulates the chiyuv kriya over the death of a chacham was discussing specifically a chacham who taught you Torah, you're obligated as an individual to cut kriya over the death of the chacham because he taught you Torah, then the word chacham is inappropriate. It's out of place. The brayso should have spoken about a rebbe and a talmud. But rather, we have to conclude that it refers to any chacham, whether you learn Torah from him or you did not, you're obligated in the mitzvah kriya. And furthermore, kol yom shmatute befumin b'bei midrasha. On an everyday basis, we quote the teachings of Rav Safra in our base medrash. We are obligated as a talmud to a rav to do kriya. So why didn't you do kriya? And Abai apparently had a tremendous impact on the audience of Chachamim. They felt very badly about the fact that they omitted the kriya, the chiv kriya, for the death of Rav Safra, and therefore suffer Maida Hava. What do we do now? So they started vacillating back and forth, and they came to the conclusion that, you know what, we didn't do kriya what we should have done kriya. Now it's too late. We say in Yiddish, farfal. It's Maida Hava. You could only do kriya, we spoke about it the other day, b'shas chimum. Now it's too late. Rav Safra is already buried, and we have no way of rectifying our sin and doing Kriya now. Amalu Abai, again, Abai puts them in that place. So, Nina, we learned in the Brisa, Chacham, Kolzman Sha'oskir Behesped Chayomim Mikroa. If the Hespedim continue, which they do for the balance of 7 days, there's always going to be Hespedim, then during that 7-day period of Hespedim, we are obligated in Kriya. So that even though a period of time has already elapsed since the death of the Chacham, but nevertheless, we can bridge that period of time 1 week forward based on eulogy, based on Hesped. As long as the Hesped is going on, then it's as if right now it's Shas Chibur. We're all in a state of grief and mourning by virtue of the Hesped. And therefore, since apparently in that scenario, the Hespedim for Avsafa was still going on, therefore, Abai said it's time for Kriya. It's not too late for Kriya. They thought, well, now's the moment to do Kriya. Amalu Abai, no. Tanya Chacham Kvoda Bespedim. The time for Kriya is at the Hesped. We're going to integrate Hesped and Kriya into one entity. And when we will deliver the Hesped, the eulogy, that's when we're going to do Kriya. So wait a while until we get to the next Hesped. Now, in the footnote here, he mentions the Rosh and the Meiri. They're of the opinion that even beyond Shiva, the period of eulogies of Hespedim still continues. In our minute, what we're familiar with is that Shloshim is the end of the Hespedim, but there could be Hespedim even after Shloshim and even for a full year. And that would be an appropriate moment in the case of the death of a Chacham to do Kriya. Another story, Kinach Nafshe de Rav Huna. Rav Huna passed on. Savrlo Suve Sefer Torah Apure. They thought it would be a kavod for the mess if they would lay a Sefer Torah on top of the body of Rav Huna. Amalu Rav Chizda, Milsa de Mechayeya, Lo Svirle, Hashto Lekum Liovitle? A rhetorical question. During his lifetime, Rav Huna was opposed to a person sitting on the same bench where there's a Sefer Torah, as we'll soon see. And therefore now, after Rav Huna dies, we're going to put a Sefer Torah on top of the Aron, of the coffin. Omar Rav Tachlifa, Anoch Azise Rav Huna. I saw that Rav Huna, the boy Lamesa Vapuri, wanted to sit down on a couch. He saw, Rav Huna saw that there was a Sefer Torah on the couch. And therefore, B'chaf Kado Ara, he turned over a jug on the ground, laid the Sefer Torah on the jug, the Osiv Sefer Torah, and only then, when the Sefer Torah was safely placed on a different still, that's when Rav Huna would sit down on the couch. So you see that Rav Huna would never dream of sitting down on a couch together with the Sefer Torah's munach on that place. How then can you put a Sefer Torah on top of the body of Rav Huna when we take him out to bury him? We're not allowed to sit on the same bed or couch or chair where there's a Sefer Torah munach. It's resting there. So therefore, it's totally out of place to rest the Sefer Torah on the coffin of Rav Huna. Lavi nafik puria mibava. A very strange thing happened. When someone dies in a house, the corpse has to be taken out of an opening in order to bring it out to the Beis HaKfaros for burial. In the case of Rav Huna, he died in a room, and the entranceway of the room was too narrow to bring his body in the bed, meaning, I'm translating mita literally, but mita doesn't really mean a bed, it means a bier, B-I-E-R, or a coffin. And the coffin was too wide to fit through the opening of the door. So what they thought would be the solution to this case, they got to get Rav Huna out to the cemetery to bury him. L'shalushe derech gagin. Shlushe means l'shalshel, is a perik in Beitza that opens up with l'hishalshel, means to lower it down. So they thought they would lower it through the roof. I guess they would take it up to the roof and then lower it down from the roof and avoid having to go through the Pesach of the Bayis. Amalu Rav Chisda stopped them. Rav Chisda is the Talmud Muvak of Rav Huna. And he says to them, Hagamrina Minei, I learned from my Rebbe Rav Huna, that Chacham Kvodo Derech Pesach. When you want to be Mechabed a Chacham after death, you take him through the doorway. You don't take him up to the roof and then down. That's not cover. They thought maybe we could take him from one beer, B-I-E-R, to another. And the second B-I-E-R is narrow relative to the first, and then there'd be enough room in the Pesach to take him through the Pesach. Only Rav says, no, my Rebbe didn't accept that either. This is what I learned from Rav Huna. There was an original mita, a coffin, a beer, B-I-E-R, right? That was designated for the Chacham. That designation is for the Chacham. And that's the covered ames for the Chacham, that he be taken out to burial in that coffin that was originally designated for him. And we're not going to now substitute a second coffin for the first. The Amar of Yehuda Marav, Minayin l'Chacham shekfodo b'mita richona, shenemar. Now the Gemara derives this from a pasuk in Tanakh and Shmuel. It says, "Vayakivu es Aron Elokim el Agala Chadasha." Okay, this has to do with the story of the Plishtim who had taken the Aron Kodesh as booty in the war after he won the battle, and now they were going to bring it back and give it back to the people of Israel. They use so now the ark is acquired, if you will, by the Jewish people, and David HaMelech is going to make sure that instead of building a new wagon, they would use the same wagon that the Aron was on from the get-go, meaning the Plishtim had built a special Agalah, special wagon, to transport the ark back to the people of Israel, and David HaMelech was makbid to use that wagon for transporting the Aron to Yerushalayim. It would not be proper to substitute a second wagon for the first wagon. And in the analogy, we are deriving the same conclusion about the burial of a Chacham. We will not take the Chacham from one mita and roll him on to another mita. So therefore, pros, bava, ve'afuka, at the end of the day, they had no choice. They had to break down the door and allow for the body of Rav Huna to be taken out through the door. Pasachale Rabbi Abba. Rabbi Abba opened up the hesped for Rav Huna. Roy Hoyer Rabbeinu Shetishral of Shechina, our Rebbe Rav Huna, who was the head of the Yeshiva in his time, he was in charge of the transmission of Torah from his generation to the next, and he was so great that he would have had Shechina. In other words, the Shechina would have rested upon him, like it did in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu. Ella shebavel garmon. Bavel is chutzlar. It's not Eretz Yisrael. You want to somehow identify with the Shechina, Shetisha Shechina love, that's only in Eretz Yisrael. There's no Shechina in chutzlar. So the Gemara asks, Moshe Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda, the Amrile Rav Hanan bar Chisda. The pasuk says by Yechezkel, Hayo, Haya, and there's an extra word here, Hayo. Var Hashem el Yechezkel mebuzi akon be Eretz Kazdim. So the Shechina appeared to Yechezkel in Chutzlar. So how can you tell me that there's no Shechina in Chutz La'aretz. The word of Hashem to Yechezkel, son of Buzi, the Kohen, in the land of the Chaldeans. We see, therefore, that the divine presence did, in fact, rest on someone in Bavel. Hafachla avua b'sandale. So Rav Chizda, who's the father of Nachman, right? Rav Nachman here is the one who said that there's nevuah even in Bavel. So his father Rav Chizda sort of hit him a little bit over the head with a sandal. Maybe he did it in a way that was very adid, wasn't obvious to the. He says he wanted to avoid embarrassing him. Omar Lane, he said to his son, this is Rav Chizda talking to Rav Nachman, his son, Lav HaMinucha, didn't I once tell you that Lotirud Alma, that you shouldn't disturb people, Tirud Alma, by asking questions that have an easy answer to them. Don't ask a question when the answer is so obvious. You're asking about Yechezkel ben Buzi, that he had nevuah in Bavel. That's not a kasha. There's an extra word here in the pasuk. Hayo haya. What's the extra haya? Could have said hayo, and that would have been sufficient. But rather, haya means shahaya kvar. In other words, Yechezkel was originally in Eretz Yisrael, and when he was in Eretz Yisrael, he received the Shekhinah and the nevuah. And once he received the nevuah, then he would continue to experience nevuah even in Chutz La'aretz. But initially, the Shekhinah does not rest upon a person outside of Eretz Yisrael. Rav Yudah Levi, the Kuzari, is famous for saying that there's no nevuah in Chutz La'aretz unless the Navi is prophesying something about Eretz Yisrael. But the Makom Shekhinah, which is Eretz Asher, Eni Hashem Elokecha Ba, Mireishas Hashem V'Arachmis Hashem Adins. That's where the Shekhinah is in Eretz Yisrael, and Ruach HaKodesh and Nevuah in Chutz La'aretz is a very problematic sugya. But nevertheless, it does seem that under certain very specific circumstances, like the case of Yechezkel, who began his prophecy in Eretz Yisrael, he would continue his prophecy even in the land of Kazan. They brought Rav Huna to burial in Eretz Yisrael. From Bavel, they took him to Eretz Yisrael. So the concept of being buried in Eretz Yisrael is an ancient concept. Amulei Rabbi Ami Rav Asi. Now there was a communication here that was misunderstood. They told Rav Ami and Rav Asi, quote unquote, Rav Huna Asi. Rav Huna is coming. They understood that meant he's coming alive, not dead. And Amru, they responded, if Rav Huna is alive and he's coming now to Eretz Yisrael, then Ki Avidanos, and when we were there in Bavel, Lo Havilan, Lidluye, Reishin, Mineh, we couldn't, Reishin means our heads, Lidluye means to lift our heads. We couldn't lift our heads in Bavel because of the greatness of Rav Huna. Who could say even a Dvar Torah in the location of Rav Huna? Is Hashda Sinan Hacha Asa Basrin. He's saying now we finally came in Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, and we thought that here will be big shots, so to speak, relatively. We're considered scholars. There we in Bavel, we were nobodies because Rav Huna was there. And now Rav Huna is coming after us. Oh no, even in Eretz Yisrael, we're going to be nobodies. So now they clarified, Amalu, that's not what we meant when we said that Rav Huna is coming, but rather Arono Ba. He has already died. Rabbi Ami, Rav Asi Naf, and Rabbi Ila, Rabbi Chanina Lo Naf. Question was, who would go out and escort and accompany the bier to burial? And some, Rav Ami and Rav Asi, went out to escort the burial, the coffin to its burial. But Rav Ila and Rabbi Chanina did not go out. Ika Diamri, we have another presentation that Rabbi Ila Nafek, but Rabbi Chanina Lo Nafek. So now the Gemara wants to analyze. Why is it that some of the Chachamim went out to escort Rav Huna to burial and others did not? Now, from the Gemara that we're about to learn, I got the impression, and I want you to tell me if you agree with this assessment, that it took a while till Rav Huna, his body reached Eretz. So from the time of his death, a relatively long period of time elapsed until they could reinter him or inter him in Eretz Yisrael. So let's read the Gemara and tell me if you get the same impression. It's not black and white. Enough. According to the one group that went out to escort Rav Huna to his final resting place, as we say. My timer, why did they do so? The Sanya, we learned in the Brisa, Aron ha'over mimakom lemakom. Now the word Aron here doesn't mean an ark, but it rather means a bier, a coffin. And you are there witnessing as they take it from one place to another on their way to burial. And you may have seen this, especially today, if a Chacham dies, the Chevra Kadisha will stop at some point before the cemetery or very close to the entrance to the cemetery, and people will walk behind to escort this gadol to his burial. So, Aron ha'over mimakom l'makom omdim olav b'shura. We are now experiencing an Avelus situation. We'll have Amida L'Shura, we'll have Omer Olav Birchas Avelim, Tanchumei Avelim. All these nihugim will apply when the Aron is being passed from one place, passing through one place on its way to another place. So again, the Gemara is saying now that Rav Huna may have been dead for a while, for a long period of time. But nevertheless, why are we required to attend his funeral and escort him to his final resting place? Because of this halacha of Aron ha'over mimakom l'makom. And that sort of is machadesh havelus. It's a whole new entity of mourning and grief because of over mimakom l'makom. Below Nafik, what about the opinion of those who did not accompany Rav Huna to his burial? This Sanya, we learned in a Brisa, Aron over mimakom l'makar. Ein omdim alav b'shura. We have a Brisa that says the exact opposite of the previous Brisa. The first Brisa says omdim alav b'shura, and not only omdim alav, omer alav birchas avelim v'tanchumei avelim, etc. The whole kit and caboodle. And this Brisa says no, that when an Aron passes from one place to another, we're not obligated in any way for Shura, or for Birchas Avelim, Nichum Avelim, or Kriya, or any of the Ve'en Omer Mola Birchas Avelim Tadchumei Avelim. So the Gemara says, Kashin Adadi, we have a black and white collision between these two brises. What is the halacha here in terms of an Aron Sha'over Mimakom L'makom? And the Gemara answers the following. Lo kasher. Kan she shildo kayemes, kan she b'she'ein shildo kayemes. How long of a period of time passed since the death of Rav Huna to the time of burial in Eretz Yisrael, burial in Eretz Yisrael? And that's going to be a measure of whether or not his bones are still, his skeleton is still in structure, that shildo, kayemes. If his sheled, if the skeleton, the bones are intact, then it's considered like a real kvura, as if he was never buried, or as if right now he's being buried and L'chayev and Kriya. And Birchas Avelim, and Tanchumi Avelim. But if that period of time that elapsed in the delay until his final burial would be such a long period of time that the bones in the skeleton are beginning to get loose, they're not intact, then it's too late for the Avelus of Amida L'Shura and Tanchumi Avelim and Birchas Avelim, etc. Now, Rabbosai, I could not figure out, maybe you have something in your Gemara, or David in yours, how long of a period of time would have had to have passed for this situation of Ein Shildo Kayemes to apply? Because I don't believe for one moment that they're going to take the corpse and figure out if the skeleton is still intact. It doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
That's why I think it should be measured in terms of a time period. I don't know, but
Right.
I don't.
Would they have to inter? Would they inter the body to discover?
It sounds like they would put the body into the burial place without exposing the body and trying to figure out, if the skeleton was still intact or not. I don't think you're allowed to do that kind of thing.
No, I don't. I hope not.
The dead are buried in tachrichim. They cover. Could be that the Chevra Kadisha, before they put on the tachrichim, and they do whatever they have to do to prepare the corpse for burial. Maybe they can testify. I don't know. It's hard for me to believe that it's so obvious to the naked eye that this corpse has already gotten to the point where the bones are shaking up. They're not really tightly attached. But maybe there's just a measurement of time from death until burial. I don't know. If you see anything, let me know.
Okay.
So again, the Gemara now says, Rav Huna Shildo Kayemes Hava. After all, we know that the period of time that it took to bring Rav Huna from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael was relatively a short period of time. What do I mean relatively? In other words, as far as the skeleton being still maintaining its structure and being intact, it wasn't too late. And therefore, everyone should have gone out to accompany Rav Huna. So therefore, Delonov, those who didn't go out, why? Lo Simur Kamed. Apparently, they didn't know how long of a period of time it elapsed. They'd assume that as a general rule, if you're taking the corpse from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, then for sure it's no longer Shildo Kayemes, and therefore they thought, oh, no. They didn't have the information that they needed to have. Amri, Hechi Nincheir. Now they want to know where is the appropriate place to bury Rav Huna, whose remains have now come to Eretz Yisrael. And they made an equation with Rabbi Chia. Rav Huna rebates Torah Yisrael, Rabbi Chia rebates Torah Yisrael. Both Rav Huna and Rav Chia, who was buried in a certain cave in Eretz Yisrael, both of them taught Torah, disseminated Torah. And therefore, it's appropriate to put them both in the same cave. In other words, that we're going to bury Rav Huna next to Rav Chia. I don't know if you've ever been on one of these trips to Poland, these heritage trips. So if you go to Warsaw and somehow miraculously the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw is pretty much intact, you will see that the Nitziv Mivalozhin and Rav Chaim Brisker are literally next to each other. And that was the minig in those days, that the leaders of Israel would be buried one next to another. And you'd have to decide next to which leader was there a connection that he should be buried right next to him. Not to be Iowa. The Gemara asks now, who would go into the cave of Rav Chia with the body of Rav Huna to bury Rav Huna next to Rav Chia? Amar Lahu Rav Chaga. Rav Chaga came forward and identified himself. I'm the right guy. Why? Anoma I'll take him in. Diokimte L'talmudoi ki havina bar tamni. Sorry, Shnini starts describing his curriculum vitae that already at the age of 18, he knew a thorough knowledge of the Talmud. Not only that, on a religious, pious level, lo chazili keri, I never had a seminal admission. Imagine, he's already almost a full-grown adult. Umishma le kameh. The shameh is the servant. Mishmeh is the verb. I served as a servant to Rabbi Chia in order to be Meshamesh Rabbi Chia, my Rebbe, during his lifetime. The Yadi Buv Dayu, and I know all of his great deeds. I saw them up front. And the next piece of Gemara just boggles my mind. Because now Rav Chaga is testifying about Rabbi Chia that Yom Echad on one day is Hapich Le Ritzua the Tefillin. You know, the Ritzua the Tefillin, the black should be showing on the outside, and his Ritzua got switched around. So like the brown side was showing on the outside, and he wasn't aware of it, Rav Huna. Terrible tragedy. Terrible Avera. Could you imagine? The Avera was that inadvertently, unintentionally, the Ritzua of his tefillin was turned around, and what did he do when he found out about it? The Yom Echad is Hapich Le Ritzua the tefillin, Yosef Allah Arboim Tanisa. He fasted 40 days because inadvertently his strap of tefillin, his Ritzua shel tefillin, was his Hapich. I would say that it's Hasidus if you would fast one day for such a thing. I don't even know if you have to fast one day. And he fasted 40 days. I don't know. This is already, Heilige Chachamim on the highest level. He writes
didn't do
in
it
the
again,
footnote.
I'm sure.
Yeah, what do you say, David?
He didn't do it a second time, I'm sure.
There is no requirement to fast in this case. It's considered pious to fast for one day. And he fasted for 40 days. This is an outstanding form of tshuva. All right, there's a lot of literature on this. Now Rav Chagai brings Rav Huna into the cave of Rav Chia, where Rav Chia is buried. Rav Chia is buried between his two sons, the eldest son on his right side and the youngest son on his left. The oldest son is on the right of Rav Chia. His name is Yehuda. Chizkiah, the younger brother, the youngest son of Rav Chia, is Mispole, is on the left. And now there's a conversation between the two brothers. The Herstamaisa, they're long gone and buried, but they're conversing one with the other. It's up to you whether you want to take this Gemara literally.
Yeah.
Amalei Yehuda Chizkiah, the older brother turns to the younger brother. Hum miduchtech. We have to rise from the kever. Like a Tchias HaMesim. Why? The lav urchiara the kaim Rav Huna. Rav Huna is coming now to be buried, and we're not going to stand up in his honor. The Hadi the kaim Chizkiah was standing up, the younger brother. Azye Rav Chaga, who's alive and well, and he's bringing now Rav Huna to his burial. And he sees in front of him Amuda Denura, a pillar of fire is coming up because Chizkiah is getting out of his kever. Ibis, he was overwhelmed with fear. But the first thing he wanted to do was to protect Rav Huna. And Zakve Larone, somehow, Rav Chaga was able to lift up the beer. It sounds like he did it single-handedly of Rav Huna, so that Rav Huna would not be hit by this fire. V'nafik awesome. and he got out of there as soon as he could. So I'm not sure exactly where he put Rav Huna at that point. But lo anish inish, he was not punished. In other words, Rav Chaga was not burnt by this amuda denora, by this pillar of fire. Mishum dezakve la'arone Rav Huna, in merit of the fact that he immediately, almost instinctively, protected Rav Huna from the pillar of fire. Enoch nafshe de Rav Chizda. Now Rav Chizda is a Talmud of Rav Huna. When he died, Savra lasuye Sefer Torah apure. Again, they thought to make the same mistake that they made when his Rebbe Rav Huna had died, namely to put the Sefer Torah on top of the mess as covered a mess. Rabbi Yitzchak Milson, the Rabbi Lo Spirale, his own Rebbe Rav Huna rejected, because remember he said he would not even sit on the same couch that there's a Sefer Torah. And non make him v'navidle? Are we going to get up there and put a Sefer Torah on the beer of Rav Chizda? Now you may remember that we discussed, I think it was 2 days ago, the following question: if you cut kriya, are you allowed to repair the kriya after shiva? And we had 3 levels. One level is ein ma'achin klal, you don't repair it at all. That's for a parent that talks. Then we have another level where you're allowed to do something called lemishla, shlila, which means you do a wide stitching, but you don't actually repair it. And then there's the third level where you repair it, complete repair, very tight stitching. Mm-hmm. So in the case of these great scholars, these sages that died, they thought that we're not even allowed to do the mishlal. Mishlal is that large, sewing. Amar lahu Rabbi Yitzchak Barami. Rabbi Yitzchak Barami told them, Chacham came in ziru pneihem me'achorei hamita sholol. Immediately when we bury the Chacham and we turn our backs the other way to go home, at that point we're already allowed to create these large stitches as basting the shlila of the part that they read. It seems that Rabbah and Rav Himnuna died pretty much at the same time. They were taking both of them up for burial. Now, it's not clear which of the 2 Chacham was greater than the other one and deserves even more kavod. It's possible that Rabbi bar Rav Huna deserved more kavod because Rav Huna was his father. So he had what we call yichus, his pedigree.